Coming up, honor, respect, and politics.
Appeals to national honor have to be appeals between moral equals, people who regard each other, so to speak, face to face, vis-a-vis.
Princeton's Kwame Anthony Appiah makes a case for national and civic respect and the cosmopolitan ideal. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
I have the privilege of introducing our guest speaker this evening, Kwame Anthony Appiah. We know Professor Appiah for his distinguished scholarship on the central question that preoccupies us here at the Carnegie Council. How can we live together peacefully while acknowledging our deepest differences? His work on the ethics of identity and cosmopolitanism has had profound effect on how we think about rights and responsibilities, citizenship and difference. His books, The Honor Code, How Moral Revolutions Happen, The Ethics of Identity, and Cosmopolitanism, Ethics in a World of Strangers, are themselves the core curriculum in ethics in international affairs. In 2012, President Obama awarded Professor Appiah the National Humanities Medal in a ceremony at the White House. I think it is significant that this national award has recognized one of the world's greatest scholars of cosmopolitanism.
My general theme this evening is going to be what I call civic honor, and I want to explore the role of honor and its negative counterpart, shame, in shaping the political behavior of individuals and of nations, and in particular in shaping the sort of moral dimensions of political behavior. My account needs to start with something about honor, and I begin with an insight that I gleaned from the anthropologist Frank Henderson Stewart, which is that honor is fundamentally about rights to respect. So to honor a person is to treat her as someone worthy of respect, as entitled to be respected. And if you recognize yourself as honorable, you will have self-respect. You will pay yourself the respect that is your due, just as others should pay you due respect if you are worthy of it. The character of the respect due, how one gains that respect, how one displays respect, and how you win and lose these rights to respect, all of these are culturally variable. But the substance of honor, the structure, rights to respect assigned by social norms or conventions, by an honor code, if you like, that, I think, is a human universal, which is why we can talk about honor pretty much everywhere. So there's a shared structure. It has different content in different places, but there's a shared structure. Now, sometimes you have honor in virtue of who you are, a president, a mother. On other occasions, you get it because of something you have done, a heroic act, or scoring high on the exams in the old Confucian system. But if you breach the codes that govern it, you can lose your honor, and that will lead, in those who care about their honor, to the feeling of shame, because shame is the response appropriate to your own dishonorable behavior. The appropriate response from others is first to lose respect for you, to cease to respect for you, and then actively to treat you with disrespect. And there's a fine old English word for that kind of active disrespect. It is contempt. And there's a fine old English verb that nobody uses anymore, which is to contemn. Respect and contempt for one person can both be the results of things done by others. So you can gain honor for and from your family, your country, your profession. And what that means is that others who share your identity, fellow members of your family, fellow citizens, professional colleagues, can be entitled to share in the respect due for what you have done. Now, to be respected is to be respected by somebody, and usually what matters for honor is the respect of some particular social group, the members of some particular social group, what I'm going to call an honor world, a group of people who acknowledge the same codes. But while honor is indeed an entitlement to respect, a person of honor cares not, or at least not only about being respected, but about being worthy of respect. For the honorable person, honor itself is the thing that matters, not the rewards of honor. Now, as I said, honor can be both individual and collective. And the civic honor that I want to talk about in this lecture takes both forms. The individual form is a kind of honor due from citizens of a state to one another. It's governed by social codes associated with the political life of the nation. and that is what makes it civic. And I'll suggest that it plays a crucial role in moving citizens to do many of the things that are necessary if a society, and particularly a democratic society, is to function well. And I'll take up the collective form of civic honor at the end, but if I call it, as it were, for a marker now, national honor, you'll already have some idea of what I have in mind. So the core of individual civic honor is quite simple. We think of people who contribute to civic life as worthy of the respect of their fellow citizens. We display that respect by treating them in ways that show our positive regard for them. When I learn my neighbor is a member of the local volunteer fire service protecting our community from the threat of conflagrations, I see her in a new and positive light. She knows this, in part because she knows that we share a code that makes this act honorable. Similarly, when I see people from my district at the voting booth, we look at each other with the mutual regard of people who know they are voluntarily doing something important together. That, at least, is true in Pennington, New Jersey. Such routine moments of recognition are part of the everyday experience of civic honor in a modern democracy, as are the corresponding moments of civic shame. So civic honor can help provide some of the motivation for the many acts that citizens need to engage in if a society, and I think especially a democracy, is to work. The reason is that many of the acts that are essential to the life of a modern nation, like voting, for example, are, in our philosopher's jargon, supererogatory. They're good things to do, but they're not obligations. So though we certainly want people to do these things, it would be wrong to punish them if they didn't. Punishment is only appropriate for a breach of a duty. They're also hard to keep track of in the ways that would allow us to incentivize them through the market. We could reward people with dollars for keeping themselves informed by public matters and voting responsibly, but how would we confirm that this is what they were doing? It would require both extensive and expensive surveillance in ways that would be unbearably intrusive. And in the United States, we have a history of not allowing people to place constraints on voting on the basis of what you know, because it was used to exclude people from the vote in a racially discriminatory manner. And anyway, if the rewards were to be substantial, well, they'd have to be, in order to have any effect, the incentives themselves would cost a great deal. A code of honor, once established, on the other hand, does the job at almost no cost, because people in an honor world automatically regard those who meet its codes with respect and those who breach them with contempt. These responses are psychologically automatic, and so the system is extremely cheap to maintain. It only requires us to respond in ways we are naturally inclined to respond anyway. If we want to incentivize the sorts of behavior that will make a modern society and state function well, we'd be wise, therefore, not to rely solely on the law and the market. And the kinds of behavior we want to encourage are widespread, diverse, and pervade all spheres of life. This is especially true in a democracy where, as we say, the people rule. Because to take that idea seriously, we have to suppose both that a people can act together and, since the people can only act through the agency of individual men and women, that there are many individual acts that together make it true that the people are ruling. So when America starts or ends a war, accedes to a treaty, gives foreign aid, raises taxes, authorizes corporations, creates patents, defines and punishes crimes, these things are done in the name of the American people. We, the American people, choose, by way of elections, the occupants of the legislative and executive positions that manage the doing of these things. And that popular election occurs through the acts of individual voters. But in a democracy, people need to be involved in government in many ways way beyond just voting, because we're managing the republic together, and its successful functioning requires many citizens playing many roles. Some will be soldiers, police officers, civil servants, judges, elected officials, employed to do the labor that is required if America is to do anything at all. Others will serve the republic from time to time as unpaid jurors or election officials. But the republic will only function properly if most of the citizens who do these things think about what they are doing in rather specific ways. Public officials must, for one thing, avoid using, or ideally even appearing to use, the powers they are granted by their public role to their private advantage. For another, they must observe norms of non-discrimination. The Republic can flourish with less than perfect conformity to these ideals, but certain basic standards, the rules against nepotism and bribe-taking, for example, are rightly enforced by the criminal law, and others, such as persistent or egregious racism or sexism in the exercise of your duties, are properly grounds for removal. But, as I've already remarked, one central task that must be performed if the Republic is to flourish is voting. Among the major reasons that democracies are better places to live than tyrannies is the fact that we can change our rulers from time to time. That disciplines those who are, for the time being, exercising authority. An effective lifetime guarantee for incumbents, able, once they arrive, to steer the state's resources to those who will continue to vote for them in return, exposes them to temptations it is hard to resist. So I want to turn now from this individual civic honor to national honor, which also engages the capacity for self-respect and shame of individual members of the nation. The respect that is due to citizens singly, in virtue of their nation's honor, derives from the fact that the nation to which they belong is worthy of respect, if it is. And the natural response to such honor, national honor, is pride. National honor travels with national pride as national dishonor travels with civic shame. It is evident in those moments of national triumph, whether in real conflicts as in battle or in symbolic ones as in the Olympics, where victory for my nation means defeat for others. And the struggle for honor among nations is often violently competitive. Consider, for example, the transatlantic polemics that led up to the American Declaration of Independence. In those debates, partisans of Britain made much of the claim that slavery was alien to British law. England was a country suffused with the rhetoric of the freeborn Englishman, and Lord Mansfield's decision in the famous Somerset case of 1772, whatever it meant as a matter of technical law, and that's disputed, had been taken by friends and enemies of slavery alike to mean that a slave who stepped on British soil was at once a free man. The fact that the Americans, unlike Britons at home, were slaveholders, supporters of the British side could argue, made them unworthy of liberty. Those, I quote, who do not scruple to detain others in slavery have but a very partial and unjust claim to the protection of the laws of liberty, the anti-slavery campaigner Granville Sharp wrote in 1769, and he was someone who supported American independence. Frederick Douglass got to the heart of the matter in a letter to another famous American, Horace Greeley, in 1845, explaining why he felt it important to campaign as he did in Britain for American abolition. Douglass wrote, "Slavery exists in the United States because it is reputable, and it is reputable in the United States because it is not disreputable out of the United States, as it ought to be." So the end of slavery shows how a concern for national honor, that is, for the entitlement to respect of one's nation, can play a crucial role in bringing people like the great abolitionist Granville Sharp to feel that they must work to change the practices of their countrymen or their country. They show, too, that the possibility of shame in the eyes of people of other nations is central to shaping these feelings. But national honor is a sensitive matter, and it has to be carefully handled. Here's a different and more depressing story. In 1929, the Church of Scotland, which had a long and successful history of missions and education among the Kikuyu in colonial Kenya, began a campaign to eradicate their practice of FGC, female circumcision, female genital cutting, whatever you want to call it. The results were hardly what they would have hoped for. Large numbers of Kikuyu left the church, founding independent African churches. The leading anti-colonial political organization, the Kikuyu Central Association, under the leadership of Jomo Kenyatta, who, as you know, went on to be the first president of Kenya, mounted a vigorous attack on the church's policies. And the result was that female circumcision became a nationalist issue. When the Mau Mau movement erupted into rebellion, circumcision was one element of the definition of Kikuyu identity for both men and women. And so a custom that seems likely otherwise to have disappeared quietly grew further entrenched. It's estimated that about half of Kenyan women today have undergone some form of genital cutting, not necessarily the most extreme forms. And sometimes it's clear, therefore, that efforts to reform in other practices in other societies from outside can backfire, as it did in this case. We, after all, are outsiders, their customs may look strange to us, but then we look pretty strange to them. And especially when the practices involve gender, they involve things that are at the heart of people's family lives, their relationships with their spouses and their children, and often their gods. It shouldn't be surprising then if outside criticism produces only a hostile defensiveness, all the more so when the customs are part of the normal life of ordinary people. In the name of our culture, our traditions, our freedom from outside independence, locals respond to foreign criticism by entrenching the very practices the foreigners are trying to get them to abandon. So instead of reform, you get backlash. Attempts to shame can inflame the national honor to hold on to our traditions as easily as they can engage it in the service of reform. So if you care about the foreign victims of these sorts of practices, you'll want to proceed carefully and perhaps learn from history. International humanitarian campaigns do not have to backfire, but it might be useful to look at one of the most notable successes and see what swings the balance. So consider the late 19th century campaigns against the millennium-old practice of foot binding in China. It began to die out among the elite in the first decade of the 20th century. But in most places, wherever the change began, it happened quickly. The campaign against foot binding didn't work immediately, but when the movement did take hold, that 1,000-year-old practice essentially vanished in a single generation. So at some point, to put it simply, the campaigners got something right. Now, the movement that eventually turned the Chinese around began with Christian missionaries in the 1860s. And in 1874, the Reverend John McGowan of the London Mission Society, who had been already campaigning for some 15 years against foot binding, and his wife, called a meeting of Christian women in Xiamen. They were then joined in 1894 by the Unbound Foot Association, which the Confucian scholar administrator Kang Yu Wei helped found. It eventually had more than 10,000 members. The next year, Mrs. Archibald Little, a successful writer and the wife of an English businessman, founded a new national organization, what she called the Natural Foot Society. And Mrs. Little traveled the country campaigning, organizing meetings against foot binding, so that together a mixture of campaigning outsiders and modernizing insiders built a national movement for change. Now, the wisest of the campaigners began by insisting on what was true, which was that they were fundamentally respectful of China's people and of what was best in China's civilization. Christian missionaries set up newspapers and magazines that gave the literati, the mandarins, access in elegant classical Chinese to ideas and events from the world outside China. The Reverend Timothy Richard of the Baptist Missionary Society, who edited a paper called the Eastern Times for a period beginning in 1890, was influential through its pages. Richard grasped that the key to China lay with the literati. He dressed as they did, and he spent a great deal of time and money writing, translating, and publishing Christian literature, catechisms, sermons, the New Testament. But he prepared himself by studying the texts that formed the core of the training for the national exams, the Confucian classics. Horrified by famines he witnessed in the 1870s and by the inability of the Manchu regime and its Mandarin agents in the provinces to respond to it, he concluded that what China needed above all was that knowledge of modern science that was, with Christianity, one of Western civilization's greatest fruits. He was convinced, he said, that in lecturing to the literati about these, what he called miracles of science, he could get them to use modern science, I quote, to build railways, to open mines, to avert recurrences of famine, and to save the people from their grinding poverty. So it was this modernizing Christianity with its vision of science and technology in the service of human needs that the modernizing literati responded to. Mrs. Little, perhaps because she was not a missionary, grasped that the association of anti-foot binding with Christianity in an overwhelmingly Confucian society was a handicap. So her campaign was also addressed to the literati as much as anyone, and she didn't mention any Christian arguments. Her main strategy was to republish and circulate anti-foot binding essays written by distinguished scholar administrators. Kang Yu Wei, founder of that first indigenous anti-foot binding association, wrote in his autobiography that the Review of the Times, one of these missionary newspapers, introduced him to Western ideas beginning in 1883, and that this is what had led him to start thinking about the question of foot binding. He had, he said, been distressed by the pain his sisters underwent when their feet were bound, And when the time came, he refused to allow the binding of his own daughter's feet, much to the consternation of his family and his in-laws. In 1898, Kang wrote a memorandum to the emperor urging him to bring foot binding to an end. Now, his memorandum compared Chinese to their disadvantage to foreigners. So we get back now to national honor. I look at Europeans and Americans, he wrote, so strong and vigorous because their mothers do not bind feet and therefore have strong offspring. But a central theme of his argument had to do with the damage done by foot binding to China's national honor. All countries have international relations and they compare their political institutions with one another, he began, so that if one commits the slightest error, the others ridicule and look down upon it. And he went on, there's nothing which makes us objects of ridicule so much as foot binding. I, your humble servant, feel deeply ashamed at heart. So this concern for China's image in the wider world reflected the way in which, over the course of the later 19th century, many of the Chinese literati, like Kang Yuwei, had been drawn into conversation with intellectuals from outside Confucian tradition. Kang was ashamed that his society mutilated its daughters, but that wasn't because people like Reverend Richard and Mrs. Little set out to shame him. Far from it. Their arguments were founded not in contempt, but in respect for China's cultural achievements. Their mutual esteem opened many of the literati to new ideas and attitudes. Kang's memorandum gave, in that fine Jeffersonian phrase, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind. But that was only possible because the foreigners from whom he learned engaged him with a decent respect of their own. He was guided by values he had come to see they shared. So a second essential reason for the campaign's success was that it created institutions. It didn't content itself just with rhetoric, just with conversation. In particular, it created organizations within China whose members publicly pledged to do two crucial things. Not to bind their daughters' feet, that was obvious, but more interesting, and not to allow their sons to marry women whose feet were bound. In a society in which marriages were arranged, there was a very good reason not to give up foot binding your daughters until there were men ready to marry them. The genius of the strategy of the anti-foot binding societies was that it responded precisely to this difficulty. It created both unbound, unmarried women and men who would marry them at the same time. To reform tradition, you had to change the shared commitments of a community. If Chinese families bound their daughters' feet because that was the normal thing to do, you had to change what was normal. So historical cases like these are complex, of course, but the end of foot binding shows, I think, how a respectful critique from outsiders, one conducted by people who display their respect for the people and the civilization they are addressing, can engage the natural concern for national honor in service of moral reform. The work must mostly be led and carried through by insiders. But outsiders, thoughtful, respectful outsiders who speak as informed equals across the boundaries of societies, can advance the cause. Appeals to national honor have to be appeals between moral equals, people who regard each other, so to speak, face to face, vis-a-vis. And that suggests that we should all commit ourselves to participating in a conversation across societies that starts with the basic cosmopolitan metaphor that we are fellow citizens of one world. The engagement of national honor across societies in the project of helping one another achieve the global realization of the basic human rights of every man and woman is one of the most powerful mechanisms, I think, for giving meaning to a cosmopolitan ideal. What struck me most about the recent Arab Spring was the way that, in the early days at least, ordinary people in the Arab world took responsibility for the public life of their societies and rejected the claim of undemocratic elites to manage the state for them. And this has brought a recovery of national honor, now somewhat interfered with by what's happened since, but at the time it brought a recovery of national honor, of the sense that we the Egyptians, we the Tunisians, are entitled to respect. But the elites have powerful resources to resist the ambitions of ordinary people, and they have allies abroad who will support them in part because they fear the rise of the same sentiments in their own populations. Still, I believe that in the long run, the thing that all governments have to do eventually in order to survive, which include securing the material well-being of most people, will eventually produce a large body of citizens who see themselves as entitled to participate in running public life. And civic and national honor will both sustain them as they sustain me and my fellow citizens here in the United States. And we have much to do. In a country that claims to be the land of the free, the United States has 4% of the world's population, but nearly a quarter of the world's prisoners. The PRC, with more than, People's Republic of China, with more than 4 times our population, has fewer people serving custodial sentences. These statistics show that we Americans have much work to do to secure the lives and liberties of those who live within our borders, and they are a source to those of us who care about American honor of a sense of national shame. It's a shame that goads us in our attempts at domestic reform, and in pointing to these sources of American shame, people outside our country can help us face up to them and recover our national honor in the global honor world. Our nation's honor has a claim on each of us. Each of us has a stake in our individual civic honor as well. American citizens who participate in the life of our republic will be guided by a sense of their individual civic honor and nourished by the respect of those at home and abroad who value what they are doing. And on days when the battle seems unavailing and the prospects of progress remote, they will be sustained too by the thought that we in America also have much of which we can be justly proud.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.